Good morning, friends. We're continuing with our roadmap for right living based on the 52 qualities that Swami Kriyananda describes in this wonderful little book, Affirmations for Self-Healing. We're dealing more with the subjects than with the subject of affirmation. And let's begin now with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Bless us with the awareness of your presence always with us. Help us to know that we live in this world by your grace, with your guidance, living in your light. Help us to awaken to this divine truth, that we may share your living presence with all. Om. Peace. Amen. For those of you who may have watched other broadcasts in this series, you'll see that the background is different because I'm in a different location. I'm in the online with Ananda studio at Ananda Village. It's my great pleasure to be spending a few days here helping participating in one of my hobbies, which is to do theater costumes. Spiritual Renewal Week, an annual celebration held here at the village, is happening at the end of June, and we're putting on excerpts from Swamiji's 3-act play, The Peace Treaty. We're not doing the whole play, but parts of it. And so I'm helping my friend Maggie, who's the costumer here, with all the costumes. And it's taken me years to figure out what my relationship to theater is, and so I finally come to the right word, which is hobby. And costumes are my hobby. It's hard for a yogi to have a fun hobby, and this one is mine. And also, of course, it's serviceful. So for the next 3 days, this will be my background, and then I'll go back to my own home turf. I got some questions about where I was, so I thought I would share it with you. We did a recording yesterday, but the gremlins got into the recording equipment, so we're going to pretend that one never happened. So here we go again. We're on number 5. Which is about the subject of sharing. And when I introduced this, which I did in an earlier broadcast, every time I come to this one, sharing, I'm always reminded a little bit of being in kindergarten. I have a couple of memories of odd kindergarten experiences. One in particular, it's very strange over the course of life to see what episodes stay in your mind. And it's been interesting to me, even at the age that I am now, which, let's see, this would have been 70 years ago when this happened, maybe even 71 years ago. I was in kindergarten, and I was always a precocious child, especially when I was very young. I learned to read very early, and I had this very big vocabulary, and often I would mispronounce words because I'd learned them in books, although my parents were very intellectually oriented, so, proper speech and lots of big words, so to speak, were just part of who I was. So I was entertaining for my teachers. But when I was in kindergarten, something happened, and the exact details of it I don't remember, but I was a naughty little girl in the way I treated some of the people around me, because I was not only precocious, I was snobby, extremely snobby. And somehow my little friends displeased me, and I behaved very badly. And how exactly all this came down, I don't know. But others took the blame for my bad actions. And my kindergarten teacher, whose face and name have completely disappeared from view, instead of reprimanding me and making me pay the price, she took it out on the other children. And I was selfish, and I was supposed to have been generous and sharing, and I wasn't. But I remember sitting around the table and the teacher allowing me to sort of designate who got what. when in fact I was the one who had been wrong. And it's interesting to me because it helps me remember the soul has no age. And the soul is always responsible on the level at which the ego is functioning at that point, is always responsible for right action. Age is no excuse. And that has always stayed in my mind because I sat there, I knew it was wrong, and I accepted it. Isn't that interesting? It's very fun. I mean, any of us who are old enough to be listening to this program, go back over your whole life and see which incidents stick in your mind and see which of them represent a moment in which you violated Dharma. I have another one from like about 6th grade in which I allowed an injustice to be carried out, a serious injustice against one of my classmates because I didn't have the courage to tell the truth. That rarely happened to me because I was extremely well trained by my parents to always stand up for the truth. So I'm glad that the incidences are few and far between. But that one when I was little was about sharing, particularly. So perhaps I always associate the word sharing with kindergarten. But so I was surprised when it's number 5 in this book, which comes after energy, happiness, love, success, and then we get to sharing. But there's something childlike about using that word. For me, what sharing has become, and it's become a core value of mine. In the first 10 years that I was living in the ashram of Ananda village at that time, and I was going through my 20s, which is also an important time, but I was also living a monastic life. I was entering onto the spiritual path my first decade, and I was solitary. And I remember during those years gradually coming to understand what my core values were. Just like what was the irreducible minimum of how I had to live. The first was, of course, in my life, that I had absolute faith in Swami Kriyananda. And therefore, he was the pole star. Everything had to rotate around the pole star. He was the voice of Master to me, and being a disciple was the irreducible line of my life. And that discipleship was expressed out of receptivity to Swamiji. But perhaps the second quality was what I called generosity of heart. So that sharing isn't just a question of, oh, I have extra money, or I will tithe, or something like that. It's the whole, generosity is going to be a different quality that we have, but it's the whole willingness to, and this is just what Swami is saying here, true happiness is found not in possession, but in sharing with what one has with others. Thus is one's self-identity expanded as he learns to live in and enjoy a greater reality. Well, when we say the first sentence, not in possessions, but in sharing what one has, but possessions are only a very small part of what one has. It's I would say, in sharing what one is, which is one's enthusiasm, one's sense of joy. Swamiji, even at the end of his life, when he talked about his own role, and by extension the role of all of us in this world, he said, above all, what we must share with others is our bliss. Because that bliss is the evidence, the living presence of the divine. And when we touch into the living presence of the divine, that's when our self-definition expands, and we learn to live in and enjoy a greater reality. It's remarkable. Swamiji used the word bliss a great deal at the end of his life. And he used the word bliss much more than the word joy at that point. It's interesting, the nuance of language. In the English language, you can say happiness, you can say joy, you can say bliss. And one can assign slightly different meanings to them, but it's somewhat subjective how you do it. When you say, I felt so blissful, that usually means more than I felt so happy. And when he would talk about sharing our bliss, Swami was talking about something of another order of magnitude so great that really the word he was using was ananda, which is a Sanskrit word which means bliss, but it's the bliss of a greater reality. It's not the bliss that is related to this plane of consciousness, because happiness and joy on this plane of consciousness exist. Again, these are just English words, but it exists because of our reaction to circumstances. But the idea of bliss is that it simply wells up from within us and is unconditioned by circumstances. It's simply a realization of our own nature. And when we realize something, then it never leaves us. We simply know it. That's why the whole use of the word self-realization, which is what Master called his work in America, is so important. Because when you realize something, you haven't acquired it. It was always there, you just didn't know it. And so this generosity of heart, generosity of spirit, is the consciousness that results in sharing, where it's just impossible to define oneself in such a way that one would hold back. Whether it's love, it's friendship, it's service, it's money, it's food, whatever it might be. These are all qualities that evolve from a changed state of realization. In many other contexts, I have referred to the fact that among the many realities that I came to understand about Swami Kriyananda through the years that I knew him, as I've often said here, for some reason of divine grace, I recognized Swamiji the moment I saw him literally in this lifetime. And how I recognized him, I have no idea, but I recognized a consciousness that I did not have, but somehow I intuitively understood that he did. And I intuitively understood that it was the pole star that I was seeking. Everything that happened in the 50 years that followed was defined by that initial realization. But over the many years, I had to gradually come to understand what the quality of that consciousness was. And one of the things that I observed, and this of course was the enormous difference between Swamiji and me, was that I had certain self-definitions that this is who I am and this is the way things are, and they all had to do with I lived in a smaller reality. I was conscious of a greater reality. I was moving toward the greater reality. But if you woke me up in the middle of the night from a dead sleep, my self-identity would immediately grab the smaller reality. But because I understood I came to understand, because of Swamiji's teaching, the nature of self-realization and how to move ever more deeply into it, I learned to behave to an extent, an ever-increasing extent, thank you, God. But nonetheless, I was always having to make conscious decisions and use my willpower and my discrimination, all the qualities that we develop, in order to express what I knew was correct. An appropriate response, a dharmic response. Dharma being defined as those actions which expand consciousness. My own first, and then others around me, if possible. But it would be a conscious act of will. And what I truly began to understand with Swamiji is it wasn't an act of will for him, it was his perception of reality. You know, I could be generous of heart, Swamiji would see everyone as belonging to him. Toward the end of his life, he would often say that in a crowd of strangers. He would say strangers, meaning people he'd never met in this lifetime. They would all seem like old friends to him. I remember very touchingly once Swamiji was always acquiring technological equipment that was useful to him, and then over the years, because he was an early adopter, I'm not quite sure which word you use, but he adopter is the word, he adopted technological advances that served his creative work as soon as they came out. So, every couple of years, especially at the beginning of all of this, things would improve greatly. So he was always buying and then moving on from different pieces of equipment for writing music and for writing books. And at one point, this great dinosaur of a printer that he had was replaced by something more efficient. So he had this this printer to give away, to discard, to pass on. And these things cost money, and we were never wealthy. So it was put out to be for sale. But this young man who was part of our community came, and he wanted to buy it for his mother. And when Swamiji realized that this man was buying it for his mother, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to sell it to you, I'm going to give it to you." And the man said, "Well, I can buy it, it's for my mother." And Swami just looked at him and said, "She's my mother too." Just like that. And it wasn't an affectation. It was, she was a mother. And you don't sell things to a mother. You give to a mother because a mother gives. And he just insisted, and he just gave this valuable piece of equipment to his mother. But that wasn't, oh, this would be a good thing to do. This was because he had learned to live in and enjoy a greater reality, because his self-definition began to include a bigger world around him. And Swamiji was always, the word I want to use is pitch perfect. He was always appropriate. He never pushed it, and he behaved spontaneously for the good of all. He wasn't generous where that generosity would be taken advantage of in a way that wasn't good for the person doing it. And again, he never calculated any of that. He himself said, that he, let me think how to phrase this. He trusted his intuition. He'd earned the right to trust his intuition. His intuition was not confused by compelling personal concerns. And he'd learned that. He'd learned that, well, mostly in previous lifetimes. But he trusted his intuition. I remember, again, the same sort of issue where I had good discrimination, so I could discern sort of what would be the right thing to do. Swami would just know what the right thing to do was. And he didn't have to think about it. I remember once when we conducted this rather complicated political campaign in town. I've written this up in various places. It was the Bicentennial Liberty Committee, which happened in 1975 and 76, because we were trying to get a master plan through the local county planning department. The head of the planning department at that time, our county was an unnoticed backwater in California. Since then, it's become a destination. It's become a very high-profile county where many people retire from more urban areas, so it's become very sophisticated. Then it was not sophisticated. And the head of the planning department had been promoted from a secretarial position, just risen through the ranks, never actually learned the rules of county planning, but just ran the department. And she was not competent. And the way incompetent bureaucrats deal with challenge is very simple. They say no. So we were there putting forth this extremely innovative, completely unknown to her form of land use, which is called a planned unit development, which, decades later is not at all unusual, but she'd never seen such a thing, had no idea how to deal with it. So she said no. And the rest of us were so naive, we thought that if we were just nice and sang our music and smiled and were sweet, that she would eventually say yes. Swamiji perceived immediately that she would always say no. And he also, from his past life as being a king and various other things, he knew how these things worked, and he realized that we needed to have her replaced. And the grand jury in Nevada County had already recommended that she be replaced because there had been so many complaints against her incompetency. So it was 1976, and Swami also saw that she was incompetent, and in her incompetency was saying no to a lot of people who were just individuals who had no recourse, whereas we were an organized group, and we had a lot of recourse. So we started this political campaign. Here I am telling this whole story because it was such a lark. And almost everyone in the community thought he was out of his mind. We were never involved in local politics. It was just, who would do that? We just weren't interested. But he knew we had to. So we started this activist campaign in which, using the freedom of America, that's why it was the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the founding of America, the BLC. And he wrote this petition, which was completely serious, about personal freedom and all of this sort of thing. And we started this campaign. And later he referred to this, he actually refers to this, but doesn't name me, in his material success course when he talks about working with people. He says you have to motivate people according to what their temperament is and how they will be motivated. And he refers to this thing that he was doing. And he talks about how he enlisted the help of one person by appealing to her sense of humor. And he portrayed the whole thing, as he did, as a, quote, madcap adventure, and got me involved. And once I got involved, I was very persuasive and enthusiastic. My generosity of heart is that I love to share my enthusiasm. I got a few other people involved. We got enough people going that we were able to pull the thing off, gathering literally thousands of signatures from the county and on and on. And we succeeded in making that happen. Now, why on earth I ever started telling you this? Oh yes, I remember. So he had this whole strategy that we followed through, which I have described in Swami Kriyananda's We Have Known Him book. Maybe it's in Light Bearer, but less so. And in the end, the incompetent director was replaced by a very competent, trained person. But step by step, I never knew what we were doing. I just figured if Swami wanted to do it, it was fine with me. And so he would say, you need to write a letter to we had one local paper, you need to write letters to the editor, and you need to complain about this event over here and this event over here. And I would literally say, and how nasty should this letter be? Medium nasty, he would say. So I'd write a medium nasty letter like this. And we used our English names. He was J. Donald Walters, a name which was not at all known in the county. And believe it or not, my name at that time was Nan Savage, which is really like a great political name, isn't it? Nan Savage. I was Nan Savage, secretary of the Bicentennial Liberty Committee. And we just created this thing. And in the end, the trajectory of it went exactly as he wanted it to go. And I remember after this big public meeting that he had called, and everything just went exactly as he wanted it to go, I said to him, did you know how this was going to play out? And he said, I'm not surprised. He said, no, he said, but I'm not surprised. And this is the whole point. He said, but I'm accustomed to trusting my intuition. He said, I didn't know where it was going, but I knew that every step we were taking was the right step. And you see, that's what happens when your self-definition has expanded to the point where we actually flow in relationship to a greater reality. We don't just affirm that we are part of the greater reality, but we actually live in that greater reality. And here it is, right here. That is how one's self-identity is expanded. In Whispers from Eternity, and it's one of the whispers, I couldn't give you the name. That's Master's book of answered prayers, poems and prayers. He speaks of learning to spend for others as happily and as easily as one spends for oneself. That phrase has always stuck in my mind. You know, if I want a new pair of shoes, I'm not even going to elevate it to the level of if I need a new pair of shoes, because for women, need and want get really close together, at least when it comes to shoes. Speaking for myself, perhaps for my own gender, I don't know. But want and need is complicated. But can I really just buy those same shoes for someone else? Same price, same style, whatever it might be, and actually feel as satisfied as if they were for my own feet. You see, this is why Divine Mother impels most people to have children. Or if they don't choose it, tricks them into having children. Because we learn then to give to others as if we were giving to ourselves. I've never raised children in this lifetime, but the reality of it is so vivid to me for who knows how many lifetimes of children. But I remember when I was maybe 20, and a friend of mine at that point had a toddler, a son, and she was the first person who was close to me who was raising children. And I remember when she came over to my house and we were trying to carry on a conversation, and the conversation, as it is when you have small children, was constantly interrupted by her son's antics all through the house, and she was getting up and pulling him back and distracting him and talking to him, and meanwhile we're trying to talk. And I said something on the level of, how can you stand this? How can you bear to do this? She looked at me like she was so puzzled. And she said, oh, I understand. She said, when you look at me and my son, you think there's two of us. She said, there's only one. Just, we are the same. And I've been told repeatedly by the parents of children that when that baby is born, there's no separation. One of my dear friends put it to me. He said he always thought he was rather a selfless person. But after his children were born, he realized that it was possible to have no self, because the children were him. And that's what we're talking about on an infinite level, that we first learn to enjoy. First we learn to live in, and then love. I love the second part. First we learn to live in and enjoy a greater reality. Because everything is about suffering and happiness. And we will just do what we think will make us happy. That's how our reasoning works. But what happens to us as our spiritual understanding expands is that we realize that it's blissful to live in this greater reality. And others look and think that this is a state of sacrifice. And you realize that, well, these words are in autobiography in many different places. Worldly people are the true renunciates. One of the saints that Master writes about in autobiography gave up great family wealth to follow the spiritual path. And someone said to him, oh, I understand you sacrifice so much, to live this life for God. And he talked about a handful of rupees compared to an infinity of bliss. He said, those who cling to the world, those are the true renunciates. That's what Swamiji is trying to show us, and that's the goal that we will all absolutely, unquestionably, eventually reach. God bless you, my friends.